In the first two parts of this video series I looked at how to make a frame look how you wanted it to look, and how to make it work with the components you're using. This final part is essentially about how to avoid killing anyone. Given it's a motorcycle frame, there is always a chance that someone will get hurt while riding it. All you can do is make sure that it wasn't the frame you built that hurt them. There are several ways a frame can badly hurt, maim, or give someone a nasty case of road rash, but they all boil down to bending. Using a set of mechanical components from a road-going motorcycle, it's hard to build something with truly awful steering geometry. Not impossible, but hard. Start using long forks from a trail or off-road bike, and it's much too easy to do. I know they used to build them like that in the 70s, but in the 70s we had lower expectations, lower life expectancies, and smoked rather a lot. Having some grasp of what rake and trail do to the way a motorcycle handles is useful, but outside the scope of this video, although perhaps material for another one. No matter what geometry the frame ends up with, the handling will be better if the frame doesn't flop around as if it was made from noodles. Apart from geometry, the other way a frame can break bad is by breaking at all. Frames break for one of four reasons: lack of structural stiffness, vibration, bad welding, and crashing. Crashing is to be expected, but there's a point where the question is, did the crash cause the frame to break, or did the frame break and cause the crash? We are trying to avoid the latter. Bad welding is also outside the scope of this video, other than to remind viewers that a TIG welder is not a magic wand and a 2mm weld bead looks pretty but isn't fully penetrating 3mm steel. Frame breaks caused by excessive loads are rare, as loads will normally cause the structure to bend before it breaks. Vibration, on the other hand, will break a frame and can be nasty, especially if it happens at speed. But, as my esteemed colleague Mr. Pete McNeely likes to say, you can solve anything if you throw enough steel at it. It helps if you have at least some idea where to throw the steel though. I mentioned in an earlier video that a frame is essentially a bracket that holds the wheels, forks and engine in the correct spatial relationship. The simplest way to do this would be a forked beam with the steering head at one end, the rear wheel in the fork and the engine slung under the beam. That is the basic principle behind a lot of early moped frames. The problem being that an FJ1200 Yamaha engine is considerably heavier than a moped engine and considerably larger. Hanging a heavy engine off of the beam is going to cause it to bend, and making it longer isn't going to help with that either. Longer is more of an issue than it might seem. If we were to attach some tube to a bench with a foot of tube protruding off of the bench, hang a weight on it, measure the deflection and call that D1. Then move the tube so that there are now 2 feet of tube hanging off of the bench, add the same weight, measure the deflection and call that D2. If you were being a little naive, you might expect that D2 was perhaps double D1. Possibly you might expect D2 to be 4 times D1 because a lot of things are the square of something else. In fact, D2 is 8 times D1 because it's the cube of the difference. The length of the lever has doubled, the steel nearest the bench is seeing much more load, and as a consequence the free end, the last foot if you like, starts getting deflected from a lower point than the value of D1 would suggest. Consider for a moment if instead of tube we'd used box section for this experiment. And specifically square box section with the same amount of metal in its cross section as the tube had. It would have given lower values for D because the 2 vertical sides of the box section would have been in line with the bending load where virtually none of the material in the round tube was. If we were to put a length of the tube and the box section in a press, then the loading to destroy them would be very similar. But apply a twisting load to them and the box section deforms more easily than the tube and gets bent out of shape much sooner. Clearly the shape of the material makes a difference, and this is called moment of inertia. If you consider a typical 70s chopper frame that was made of 1-inch diameter tube with a 10-gauge wall. Moment of inertia means that a tube with a diameter of 1¼ inches but a 14-gauge wall, roughly 60% of the wall thickness, weighs much the same per foot, but is considerably stiffer. That said, it's also more susceptible to getting dented, which changes the shape and thus the moment of inertia. Admittedly, this isn't exactly what's happening in a motorcycle frame, but it's definitely helpful to bear in mind if you're thinking of building some extreme style of frame. Rather than building a beam structure then, most custom motorcycle frames are more closely related to a truss structure. Since it's inconvenient to run a frame rail through the cradle to triangulate it, it's fortunate that the engine that goes in the cradle is a large and relatively stiff lump of metal which will serve as an adequate way to brace the front cradle. This is the main reason I use as many engine mounts as possible if I'm designing the frame. The rear upper mount on the CB750 frame I built could be improved by making it a triangular plate and having 2 bolts at the frame end. A frame isn't a true truss though, and equally the steering head wouldn't be up to much if it was welded to the frame at the junction of 2 sets of tubes. The simple fact of the weight of the motorcycle generates a turning force around the steering head. Popping wheelies and applying the front brakes in vigorous fashion put even larger loads on it. Since this is the point where there is the most potential for disaster if the frame should fail, then it's clearly a good idea to ensure that it's stiff enough for the job at hand. My usual solution is to add a brace tube between the top tube of the frame and a gusset between the down tubes, keeping it close to the steering head at the down tube end, and as far back along the top tube as is practical or commensurate with getting the valve cover off of the engine. Valve clearances are essential regular maintenance on a Japanese 4, and having to take the engine out of the frame to do it is frankly bloody annoying. There are other ways to brace the steering head adequately, recreating the look of a Harley with additional gussets. Goosenecking the down tubes, which makes mitering them into the steering head easier. And of course boxing it all in with some big old gussets. Which in its turn brings me to gussets. There are 2 major issues here. Firstly, there's where the gusset goes on the tube, secondly there's the shape of the gusset. Where the gusset goes on the tube relates to the moment of inertia I mentioned earlier. If the gusset meets the tube in such a fashion that it forms a lollipop in cross-section, the tendency is for the gusset to deform the tube, leading to what is known as a fatigue crack along the line where the gusset is welded to the tube. If on the other hand the cross-section through the tube and the gusset forms a letter P, then the tube tends to get twisted by any loads and everything is stronger and less likely to break. You might be thinking about spider web gussets at this point. That is definitely a case of throwing more metal at it to make it work. The shape of gussets also comes into play. Simple flat-ended rhombus-shaped gussets do little more than move the stress point to the end of the gusset. The reason for the traditional fish mouth gusset is that the narrow parts of the fish mouth start to deform as well, so the point where the tube is flexing is constantly moving and reducing the probability of a fatigue crack forming. The other thing gussets are doing is shortening the tube run, which makes it stiffer. Cross tubes also effectively shorten the length of a tube run, and I usually have one between the down tubes at around the height of the front upper engine mounts, as well as one top and bottom for mounting the rear mudguard or fender. Vibration failures are a little weird as they seem almost mystical, but aren't that hard to sort out. The thing that vibrates most on a motorcycle is the engine, so singles and twins are more prone to this than 4s due to the amplitude of the vibrations. If you think of each frame member as a guitar string, it will have a natural frequency it vibrates at. If that natural frequency matches up with a frequency, or the harmonic of a frequency of the engine vibrations, after around 10 million cycles the frame will fatigue and a crack will form at one end of the tube in question. 10 million sounds like a lot, but if you divide 10 million by 6,000 RPM you get about 27 3/4 of an hour, which isn't especially long, and since it can be a harmonic of that time, perhaps as little as under 14 hours of run time. Normally if this is happening anywhere critical you will notice the vibration through your hands, feet, or often, your arse. The fix is to identify the frame member by holding the engine at the critical RPM and feeling the frame tubes for the one that vibrates, and then adding a gusset to that tube. This in effect changes its length and retunes it to a different frequency. It has nothing to do with adding any strength. That said, normally the thing has cracked by the time I've found it. But on the other hand, every time it's happened, which is twice, the gusset thing fixed it. If you've ever wondered about the varying balance factor on Triumph cranks, there's your answer. It changed when they changed the frame to keep the engine from resonating the frame. Finally, consider every Japanese motorcycle with a steel frame. Take a good look at one and notice how very seldom there is a well that runs around the circumference of the tube other than at the very end of that tube. Even when it's an obvious water trap and will eventually lead to a corrosion failure, or your Z1000 falling over when the side stand bracket peels off of the frame after the tube rotted out. Try very hard not to weld around a frame tube at a bracket. I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed the video, because you're still here, but if you felt it was informative then please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you felt the format was good, maybe leave a comment, because while I'm just Neil the AI, a little appreciation goes a long way to keeping me employed. Take care of yourselves, and hopefully see you again.